Hello everyone, a good day to all of you. Hope you're all doing well. I want to do a follow-up review, pretty long-term review on a pretty small part, the Manta Defense M-Lok rail covers. The reason for doing this is, although it is a small part, so far my original review from about 2 years ago is still the only one out there, and personally I don't fully like how I did that review. I feel like I kind of focused on a lot of details that are kind of irrelevant, so I wanted to follow it up, and also I've learned a few things more about how well these rail covers do after, like I said, about 2 more years of use. First, with the context of how much I've been using these rail covers, I have a lot of them. I have well over a dozen of them now. I've been using them on pretty much every one of my rifles. Recently, I have started switching over to a lot of rail scales and just a lot of different types of rail covers. For example, these Strike Industries ones, just because they retain cables. And so I have a lot of better points of comparison compared to in my original review when I only really compared the Manta Defense rail cover to the BCM. So I wanted to start out with how to install these rail covers because they are a pretty different installation procedure than what you would normally expect. For instance, it's not like just your standard BCM or a lot of the just really simple polymer ones out there where you just pop it into an M-Lok slot and you're done. In the case of this one, so first off, you can see that this takes up 2 slots of M-Lok. The way that it works is when you buy it, it ships in a pack of 3, at least as of recording this video. And when you get your rail cover itself, just looks like this. And then you also get a pack of friction locks, which are those little black kind of almost rectangular tabs you can see in there. These are just a hard polymer. And then last thing that Manta will ship these with is with lubricant. So what's important to note, first off, for me, it took me the longest time to understand what their lubricant was because they ship it with just some hand sanitizer, and that is their lubricant to put it in, which admittedly actually does work pretty well for their design, which will make more sense as I explain how this works. So what you do, this is just sort of a silicone, kind of a rubbery feel to it, and you just take the male end, just put on a bunch of that hand sanitizer, lubricant, whatever you want to call it, if you want to be fancy about it. Just put that in, push these through here. It'll deform a little bit, of course, because it's just kind of like that silicone material, and then seat it in there. Once the hand sanitizer dries, which is pretty quick because it's just alcohol, it's in there pretty well. Now, you can push these through even without using the lubricant. It's just, it'll prevent the likelihood of tearing it when you're putting it in, which will be pretty important for the next step when you put in the friction locks. You want to make sure they're nice and tight in there, which is my first somewhat complaint. So when I first got these Manta rail covers for the first several months, they worked totally fine. On some of the rail covers, the friction lock, or I should say just that female area where it's recessed for the friction lock to go into, it's just a little oversized from the factory. So these ideally should feel pretty tight even when you lubricate them, because you should lubricate them as well when you're putting them in. But occasionally I've had just some of these fall out. So it's not the most terrible thing to lose the friction locks, because actually the rail cover itself is really, really well in there just by tension, friction alone. But you do want the friction lock, which helps to expand this and just really hold it in place. And it also helps to hold its shape. So when you're really moving and kind of brushing up against the sides of it, it doesn't want to scrunch up on itself, which without the friction lock installed, it will do that. So pretty much what I've noticed is if you get a rail guard that feels tight on both of the friction locks right out the gate, it's going to hold up fine. However, if you get one where it just seems a little bit too loose, and you know, even when you push in the friction lock all the way, it just kind of feels like it's wanting to fall out potentially on its own, it probably will later down the line, and that has happened to me. I've lost 2 friction locks under recoil. They'll just slowly start to walk out, and if you don't really constantly keep checking it like that and pushing it back in, then eventually it'll go. So what I would recommend, if that happens to you and if that's something you really care about, then go with a different type of rail cover in the first place, but there is the potential for the slots to be a bit out of spec as well. So just make sure it fits well, and if not, then try one of the other rail guards, because they're all potentially slightly different there, so you might get one that was just made a little bit larger from the factory, like I said, which happened to me a few times. But other than that, I haven't ever lost any of the actual rail covers themselves. They've held in really well. The friction locks are just kind of an added insurance, which could have been done better, certainly. But other than that, this will fit on absolutely all types of M-Lok handguards. There's no additional stipulations to its usage. And I just bring that up just, you know, compared to something like the rail scales, which has this little wing you can see here to the side. Although I really do like these rail scales with the wing, and I've pretty much switched to using these across the board wherever possible. That's a big stipulation, is wherever possible, because you have to make sure that the flats are just the exact correct length, and unfortunately, in a lot of cases, especially on these HKs and AKs with M-Lok handguards, they don't fit that dimension. So I still do end up using a lot of these in those cases. Now, as far as the texture on this, like I said earlier, kind of like a rubbery feel. It really does absorb heat remarkably well. I did some thermal testing of some other stuff, but I just so happen to have these Manta Defense rail guards on there at the time. And you can just see that the handguard is getting a little bit hot. Now, granted, this wasn't after too big of a string of fire. I think it was just 10-ish rounds. But as I said, you can see that the handguard was getting kind of warm. The barrel was super hot. The suppressor was extremely hot. But just that little section that was guarded by this rail guard was cold. So awesome there. Well, I say cold. I should say more comfortable to hold. I do like using rail covers in general, just because they do help to keep the aluminum metal handguard a lot more temperature neutral, whether it's colder or more hot. And as far as maintaining a neutral temperature, these Manta Defense rail guards do a great job at that. Now, one more point I did want to touch on, which is actually something that I did touch on my original review, which I feel like I spent way too much time on, but it is still relevant, so I did want to point it out, is removing these. So these actually aren't too hard to remove, contrary to what I said originally, but one thing you do need to be careful of when removing these is, if possible, try to put in a little bit more of that hand sanitizer when you are removing them. The reason for that is, if you just pull these out, which you can do, absolutely, and I've done it on occasion too, but you can potentially stretch and kind of tear out the actual rail guard if you're not careful. So yeah, when you're removing that friction lock, just try to get a little bit of that lubricant in there, just so it removes it a lot smoother, and it'll make the guard last a lot longer. Because if you are constantly removing this, putting it back on without using any lubricant, then it can potentially damage it. And then, of course, you get that just permanently out of spec and enlarged, and then, like I said earlier, you'll lose your friction locks a lot. But as far as wear, just on the rail guard itself, this one has been on here forever, pretty much, since I did that original review a little over 2 years ago. And you can see it really is in pretty much perfect condition. It is just that nice sort of rubbery feel to it, and so it springs back from a lot of the stuff that happens to it. And this does see quite a bit of wear on this specific point, because I do go down on barricades, for instance, shooting off of obstacles. Just pretty much always brace off of right about here. Last, as for the colors that you can get this in, this one's in FDE. I haven't seen too much variance in their FDE line. It matches pretty well to the rest of the rifle here, you can see. And then they make a black, of course, no real complaints about black. It just matches with everything else that is black. But then they do also have olive drab. Now, I don't have any of their olive drab M-Lok rail guards. I have one of their tack wraps, and that tack wrap, I actually did notice a pretty big color variation between the wrap itself and the rail guard that goes over the top Picatinny there. I think that their olive drab does tend to vary a little bit more. If you want to pick these rail guards up for yourself, you can get these on Manta Defense's own website. I'm actually not too sure of very many resellers. It doesn't seem like they resell their stuff too frequently, though I have seen it on occasion. But yeah, your best bet is probably just going directly to their site. They're not too terribly expensive either. They are more than, say, like the BCMs, which I always do bring up because they're just a really good, solid, just nothing too fancy about them, but they do their job really well. So thank you all for watching, and if nothing else, I hope you all have a good one. See you all next time.